The title of the webinar is Cloud Computing Session 2, State Panel Discussion, November 13th, 2018.
Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, you may press star 1 on your phone to enter the question queue. This conference is also being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I will turn the conference over to Joyce Rose. Thank you, and please begin.
Thank you. Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. Given the positive response to the September 5th webinar, we have invited our previous state participants back to continue the discussion on cloud computing. I'm Joyce Rose, your host and facilitator for today's discussion. Next slide, please. So I want to welcome back Linda, Jay, Valley, and Joe, our expert panel, and ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Linda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Jewell. I'm the Assistant Director, CIO for the Arizona Department of Child Safety.
Hi, I'm Jay Cline, an infrastructure architect over at Arizona Department of Child Safety.
Hello, everyone. My name is Valli Manalan Thirinjanam. I go by Valli. I'm the Director of Applications, Maryland Department of Human Services.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Vascola, and I'm the CIO here in Florida at the Department of Children and Families.
Okay, thank you very much. Next slide, please. So attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with questions or comments. The participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will be queued up and addressed during the Q&A session. As an FYI, to comply with 508 standards, please note that addresses will be read aloud. So once today's roundtable has ended, you may submit additional questions to ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or to your federal analyst. Also, we are very pleased to announce that all previous webinars are now posted, including the September 5th Cloud Computing webinar.
The webinar can be found online at https://www.acf.hhs.gov/cb/state-panel-cloud-computing.
Okay, next question, or next slide, please. So our roundtable participants will provide a short refresher of the respective cloud implementations, followed by an in-depth discussion of these related topics, which were actually introduced in the previous Cloud One webinar. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of using singular versus multiple cloud providers. We're going to do some discussion about the cost of cloud computing, pricing and billing models, and governance. What tools are being used? What are the state IT versus agency IT roles? And then roles of the agency IT staff, and then the ever-popular lessons learned. Next slide, please. And I'm going to ask Arizona, Jay, Linda, to describe your environment.
Sure. This is Jay from Department of Child Safety in Arizona. So this is an outline, basically, of our current cloud computing infrastructure that we're using. We're set up primarily to leverage almost all vendor-related cloud computing architectures as much as possible. We have a very small, roughly 6 server in terms of physical servers, and everything else we try to put in a hosted type of environment. We're mainly hosted in Azure, specifically the Azure government tenant. Most of our communication and messaging services go through Office 365, which obviously includes email, Skype, OneDrive, and we're currently implementing a very large implementation of Dynamics 365, which is going to be replacing our old child welfare system with our brand new Guardian-based system, again, all hosted inside the cloud environment. We have a VMware Horizon implementation, which allows our providers, non-DCS agencies, to interact with our systems in a secure manner, which is hosted in VMware's platform. We have a vendor that actually hosts our mobile application, which is our tablet adjustment for our field workers, which is also hosted in an Azure government environment. And we're currently onboarding OnBase, which is our enterprise content management system, which is going to hold all of our records, HR information, any documentation that we want to have held for specific retention periods and being able to call back as needed.
Next slide, please. Jay, you have a second slide here.
Yeah, we have another one. So this kind of outlines where the Department of Child Safety currently sits and where we're more transitioning to when looking at our hosted environments and cloud infrastructures. So if we take a look at this right now, there's two red icons for sort of users up top, and that kind of looks at how we currently work today with the DCS providers interacting with the VMware VDI hosted desktops, which go into our Azure Gov environment, which then start talking to a physical environment, mainly sitting at a mainframe-style environment where our current child welfare system lives, and that mainframe then has lots of data exchanges with other state agencies and other entities as well. Then we have our mobile users, which are internal DCS users, which are currently hosting in the other Azure environment, the other Azure government environment, which again goes through our Azure government environment, and then again, of course, back to the mainframe. What we're transitioning to is a much more hosted environment by getting rid of the mainframe and almost all physical components entirely, and moving to that Dynamics 365, where all of that information and all of the end-user portal and end-user activity, be it for a state constituent to a provider to a DCS employee, all interacts through Dynamics, which will talk back to our hosted our Azure environment for certain data interchanges, but then our Azure environment will interact with other state agencies, be it Department of Health Services, be it education, to be able to exchange information back and forth and relay that through Dynamics back to either the end users, be it a provider, state constituent, or Department of Child Safety end user. So what we're trying to do here, really the big push, is to get rid of that physical mainframe and as much of that physical infrastructure that we're currently hosting, and leverage as much of a hosted model and tiered model as we possibly can.
What's your timeline to get over to the Dynamics 365 environment?
So we have roughly a 5-year time frame, and we're in year 3 at this point. So we're a little over halfway done.
Good. Congratulations. So let's, next slide, please. Let's move to Florida's environment. Joe?
Thanks, Joyce. This is Joe Vastola again. So here in Florida, we've done a couple things. I think most importantly, as far as our overall support for our program goes, we've moved our child welfare system, the state's child welfare system, to the cloud, lock, stock, and barrel. So we're running all development, tests, training, and the full production system in the cloud. And that's opened up a number of opportunities for us. We've had it in the cloud since last December, and we've since added to our cloud portfolio. So there's a number of things that we're implementing and have implemented that are both connected or associated with our child welfare environment or our overall infrastructure. And so one of those is a data environment. So we've implemented a master client index, and we're in the process of integrating that with a tool and environment for master data management, for data governance, and integration of all of our, basically all of our programmatic data here at the department into a single environment where you can access for operational or analytics purposes all of the data. And here in Florida, when I talk about our programs, it's public assistance, it's child welfare, and it's substance abuse and mental health. And so we've, as a foundational element sitting underneath our MDM and our master client solution, we've implemented a virtual big data environment in the cloud. And whether whether the data sits in the cloud like child welfare or outside of the cloud on different platforms like public assistance and substance abuse and mental health current system, which are in our state data centers and across mainframe and mid-range platforms. That data environment links and creates a virtual picture in the cloud of all of our data integrated through a master client index. And so that's hosted in the cloud today, and our goal really is to put an environment in place that's a one portal for, as I said, operational purposes and all analytics and all data governance across all of our major systems and data. So that's up and running. We're in the process of finishing work to hook that up to its final data sets in substance abuse and mental health. In addition to that, we've put in place a what I'll call a data science and analytics layer. So we've implemented a number of tools. We've got, particularly on our child welfare program, a lot of interest in multi-generational analytics and looking at the data that we have in our system. We've got over, I think, 30 years worth of data. When we implemented our child welfare system, we had converted two previous systems into it, and it's now been running for almost 15 years. So we've got a lot of interest in not only connecting data across our programs, but also in looking at what are the new understandings that can be built from accessing this information. And so we've implemented a data science layer and some tools so that our programmatic and consulting resources can get to that data and cut it pretty much the way they want. And then also running in the cloud today, we've got a security incident and event management tool that basically monitors our whole environment, not only in the cloud, but also on-premise or in our data center. And we use that to keep track of all access and all utilization of all of our servers.
Cool. Very impressive. Very impressive. Valley, you want to tell us about Maryland? Next slide, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Maryland, we actually started this program called Maryland Think. Think is basically the Total Human Integrated Services Network. What we have done is not just child welfare, but we are working with other agencies as well. So the system that we currently are in the process of building is including child welfare, adult services, and juvenile services. This is one system. And we are also bringing our eligibility system, the statewide eligibility system, as well as child support system. So these three major programs within our agency, we are actually recreating these applications in the cloud environment. So from the diagram on the screen, we have the state security and administration layer. You see that that controls the access management. We have a client or customer portal. So we have many portals that we are in the process of building. We have a case worker portal. And then, of course, we have the mobile app. That's on the user access layer perspective. In the cloud infrastructure, we are currently completed the infrastructure build-up for all our applications. So this is our development through pre-production environments. So all the environments are built out. We did have two smaller applications already deployed to production as well. At this point, I would say about 15% of our programs are moved to production, and about 30% are in the process of getting moved to production within the next 6 to 8 months. So the child welfare system will move into production by end of October next year. So from the architecture perspective, we have a similar kind of a structure what Florida has done. We have the shared platform we call MDThink platform. We have the security layer, which allows statewide single sign-on. So we have integrated that with our statewide Active Directory domain. We have enterprise service bus, rules engine. So we are actually using Corticon for our rules engine. We have DevOps pipeline completely built to automate our deployment. We have API management. This is another added security layer we built. We have our security log management. We are using Splunk for that. BI and reporting layer, we are using ClickSense. Master data management is a product that we have actually brought. We are using Informatica MDM. Enterprise content management is our in-house tool. We have built using Hadoop, Elasticsearch, primarily to build that. Now we just enhanced that within the last week. Actually, we made the OCR type of feature now, so we can actually scan and extract text and index that text as well. So that capability is now added. Enterprise search allows us to search across the data from multiple applications and agencies. And of course, we have a data lake which runs on MarkLogic database, the NoSQL database. And then from this layer, we have plugged in the application layer, the individual applications I just talked about for the child welfare, adult services, juvenile services, and the integrated eligibility and child support applications. So these actually live within this platform. And we have also created a layer for interfaces. So this includes, federal interface as well as state interfaces in terms of file exchange, real-time exchange using web services, FTP type of data as well. So that's kind of like our overall architecture from Maryland perspective.
Excellent. Excellent work going on. So let's now move to the real meat and potatoes of this webinar, and that's our panel discussion with our experts. So I'm going to pose the first question to Joe, and the question is your state using a multi-cloud approach, which is made up of more than one cloud service from more than one cloud vendor, either public or private? Can you speak to the pros and cons of either model? Joe?
I'm here. I was reading with you, Joyce. Thank you. So yes, we do employ a multi-cloud approach. And let me set a little bit of the context for here in Florida. So our child welfare system is running in AWS, Amazon Web Services. We also have Microsoft Office 365 that's hosted in Microsoft. So I think from my perspective, I don't think that we would ever be in a position where we wouldn't have a multi-cloud vendor. Now, our child welfare system is running in the public AWS cloud. We have both health information and personally identifying information in the system, and so the public cloud does have the necessary controls and security requirements that we need to be able to host there. And over time now, we've been working, although I said that our child welfare system has been running since last December, we did have about a year and a half of prep and conversion time leading up to that. And so during that time, the department did, in addition to our child welfare system, contract with system integrators to implement other systems, particularly in our substance abuse and mental health program, that turned out to be selection of vendors that had fully hosted solutions. And so we had a big discussion here around what were the pros and cons of multi-cloud approach, and it really boiled down to a very simple strategy, and that is where we have to manage, we have to control the department, the managed services for our cloud, not necessarily the infrastructure, right, the network and instances in the cloud, but where we have to put in place managed services that we manage through our contract for a solution. Then we are mandating that our solutions go into the AWS cloud. If vendors are showing up with solutions that are fully hosted or fully managed by that provider that we've contracted with, then we look at other options for multi-cloud. But we'll also talk to them about hosting in Amazon. And really what that boils down to is not necessarily an interest or an assessment of one cloud vendor being better than the other. It's economies of scale. So we, in converting our child welfare system, we pulled that out of our state's data center. And so here in DCF and my IT team, I don't have a group of resources that were managing that environment, patching servers, doing all the things that you have to do with infrastructure. So we had to procure those managed services for that solution. And there's a set of skills that we have to monitor that vendor, make sure they're meeting their performance metrics, to bring new instances up in the cloud, to work with them. And so I think it's a little more, what we realized or believed was that it would be a lot more challenging to have a number of different managed services providers managing cloud infrastructure separate from how many cloud vendors you had hosting your solutions underneath those managed services. So generally, for us, it was a matter of economies of scale with people, and it was also the network infrastructure that needed to be put into place. So where we have multiple private high bandwidth connections to multiple cloud providers, that's kind of what we're trying to avoid here.
Okay. So, Joe, I think what I hear you say is that you have multiple cloud providers, but you have a singular managed service provider?
That's right. That's been our model so far.
Okay. All right. Linda, Jay, Valley, do you have any different setup, or can you speak to whatever model you might have chosen?
Hi, this is... Oh, go ahead, Valley.
Oh, thank you. No problem. So from Maryland perspective, we only have one vendor. So we are actually working with Amazon Web Services Cloud. So the way we actually got that contract is a multi-state contract. So there are not just us, multiple states are actually working with AWS for the hosting contract. And we also now actually using the AWS cloud to host multiple other states' agency applications. So right now our goal is to just stick to one vendor for hosting. And we do have multi-region availability, so we should be able to use any region we want. So that's what we are currently working on. I believe in the near future, we may change our approach, but for now, we want to stick to one vendor. This gives us many advantages over having multiple vendors. Since we are using pay-as-go model, the more we use, we actually get kind of a discount from the usage perspective, working through our Amazon resellers. So that will help in the future, in the long-run perspective. That's one option. And the other thing is we actually are using our resources and training them to use, AWS, cloud infrastructure. Also, we are using a lot of automation tools, so that helps as well from, introducing efficiency and also maintaining it in a very seamless way. So that's one of the key aspects as well why we want to stick to one vendor. I mean, I would say we are not locking ourselves to one vendor. In case if we have to move to any other cloud vendor, we may be able to do that because we are kind of normalized our software stack. So we are not really having any hard dependency with one cloud vendor. So that's another approach.
Okay. Linda, you have something to add, please?
This is Jay over at Arizona Department of Child Safety. So, I mean, we have resources and applications being hosted on 6 or 7, different main cloud vendors at this point in time. And I mean, for us, a lot of it was really looking at getting the options that we needed as kind of the quote-unquote best of breed available from whoever provided it. The one thing you obviously need to keep in mind of, and Joe mentioned this earlier, was your network connectivity. I mean, when you start dealing with cloud-based services, your network connections is arguably one of the most important things you need to consider because, I mean, these are hosted environments that could be, thousands of miles away, and if you don't plan for that accordingly, then the end user usage of them is going to suffer, and it's not going to be adopted well. But once you find an option that you want, a lot of these cloud resources can be looked at very similarly as if you would be looking at almost any other type of software or platform procurement. You have to find the one that matches what you need. And I'll use one from ours as a pretty specific example, and that was our virtual desktop infrastructure. There's lots of options for hosted virtual desktops that exist. I mean, VMware, Citrix, Microsoft has options, AWS has options to get this stuff done. And, one virtual desktop isn't necessarily better than another. A VDI is a VDI. But there are different nuances to them, and one of them specifically being licensing of those desktops. Do you provide per user? Do you want per concurrent, connection? What type of connectivity do you provide to those hosted data centers? And for us specifically, because of how we used them, concurrent licensing was very important. We didn't want to go based on named user, and at the time, there was only one vendor that allowed that, and that was specifically VMware. AWS is a great service, but couldn't do concurrent licensing, which would have almost increased our cost at almost tenfold, based on how we actually license and use those VDI desktops. So while AWS, again, does provide the service, VMware lined up better to our requirements, both on providing the service and lining up with how we could budget, pay for, and use it correctly. Other options as well, sort of go through the same thing. For us, Azure Government was very important because as we started hosting more and more of our infrastructure, not just applications in the cloud, government side was very specific in terms of making sure we had all the FedRAMP compliance for all state and federal information that we were hosting. So rather than going on the commercial side, the gov side just provides that little extra bit of nuance to make sure that when we do want to host something up there, we have the controls to make it available. When we're going with enterprise content management, such as Highland, vetting Highland specifically is to know what are your capabilities based on what we need and how does that interact with our current hosted environment, again being Dynamics, O365, and Azure, are all important. Can SharePoint do a lot with what potentially Highland can do? Sure, but Highland's better, plain and simple. So, having these different platforms can provide a little bit of complexity when it comes to the network, but in the end, if you manage them similar to how you would manage even on-premises software products, you can get a really robust environment for less management than you would ever have in-house.
Thanks, Jay. This is Linda. Just to add to that, as a leader, we just want to look at the best or let the requirements of what the agency has to determine what our cloud approach is. So, we can have commercial, we can have government, we can have software as a service, we can choose to host it in our Azure government tenant. We really rely on the requirements to drive what our cloud solution will be.
We just can't get away from defining requirements, can we?
No.
All right, Linda and Jay, while I have you up at the microphone, let's move on to some discussion about understanding the cost of cloud computing. There's commonly two pricing models. There's either a static fixed price or dynamic. Which model applies to your state, and what criteria were used to make that decision?
Jay speaks.
Well, so this is honestly more, in my opinion, a vendor prescribed situation. It really depends on what you like. So we have certain environments which are you get paid per consumption. So in Azure, for example, you spin up a virtual machine. You pay for however long that virtual machine's online, and when you turn it off, you stop paying for it. So I would consider that much more of a dynamic type environment. And it has, obviously its pros and cons to it. If we need a resource for 6 hours, I can spin that up and 6 hours later turn it off, and we're no longer paying for it. Fixed price is starting to come more and more online, even in cloud similar situations like Azure. Azure allows you to do, and I know Amazon has done this for a while, but do things like reserved instance. So I could buy a virtual machine now and prepay for 3 years of usage of that virtual machine for a drastically discounted price. So I can do now fixed-priced assets and dynamically priced assets in a single cloud vendor. It just depends on which one makes sense for the project, the resource, and the utilization of that resource. Other options, I'll go back to VDI again. With VDI, we had very, very specific requirements. How many users were going to be connecting, how many desktops we knew were going to be up and running, and the number of concurrent connections to them, which made it very simple for us to project through a long period of time, specifically a year, to say, in a year, I'm going to use this amount of resources. So I can go to that vendor and say, I want to prepay for a year for this amount of resources and save some money, roughly 25%, off of a month-by-month cost. If you have that information and they're willing to give you that discount, obviously go for it. I mean, there's no reason not to. But a lot of the flexibility the cloud provides is that capability of that pay-as-you-go pricing. So if you don't have those requirements, you don't have that information up front, the dynamic option really speeds ahead and says, well, as long as obviously your state has the budget to spin up those resources, turn them on as necessary, but use them correctly. Try to use them a bit smarter than you would as an on-prem resource. These are different managed options as they were before. You don't turn it on and leave it on 24/7 just because you own it. Having the ability of scheduling downtimes, going into a resource and saying this is not needed on a weekend. We can automatically turn these off, and for those 2 days, we're not paying for the uptime of that virtual machine that is sitting there doing nothing. When looking at hardware on premises, a lot of times people looked at saying, well, I need to provide for 24 CPUs and 80 gigs of RAM in a box because at one point during the week I have that load that's necessary. In a virtual machine environment in something like Azure, you don't scale up on a resource where you just keep piling resources on. It's usually easier to scale out into multiple tiny virtual machines that you can power on and power off as needed, as long as you have the management infrastructure behind it. That management infrastructure is arguably, especially in a dynamic pricing situation, is an extremely important aspect of it because, again, if you just leave those on 100%, you're paying for them 100%. But if you use them efficiently and you use the automation tools behind it effectively, you can cut down the cost of a dynamic environment 30 to 40%, which is roughly what we did. When we set up our initial Azure environment, inside Azure Gov, we had roughly 75 to 85 virtual machines running anything from domain controllers, DNS services, DHCP services, everything your normal infrastructure would run. And after roughly about 6 months getting that all set up, making sure everything was tested, running well, we then started putting the automation in place to say which of these services truly needs to be on 24/7 and which of them can be rotated on and off. And once we did that, there was roughly a 30% decrease in our monthly dynamic billing charges. So understanding those options and how things are billed and understanding how you can take advantage of them, in my opinion, is more important than understanding, than saying, do I want dynamic or fixed pricing? That's really more dependent on the requirements that you have up front.
Right. So I'm gonna move into the next question, but it relates to understanding pricing and billing models. And then I'm going to ask Joe and Valley to provide their input. So cloud service providers generally have their own pricing strategies. Some are pay-per-use fixed price. Some are pay-as-you-go, pay for the resource. Another is a subscription where the end user pays in advance for the services they are going to take for a predefined period of time. So Joe and Valley, which scheme does your state use, and how did you arrive at that decision?
Hey, Joyce, it's Joe. So we started down the path of only an interest in a pay-as-you-go, consumption-based model, mostly because of the opportunities for cost savings from many of the reasons just explained to us. What we have moved to, though, is to take advantage of additional savings. You heard mention this idea of reserved instances. So we know within our system, our child welfare environment, it's going to be in the cloud, from now until whenever we move it out, which is not going to be anytime soon. So we've maximize our cost savings by identifying as many instances as we can as reserve instances. That's not necessarily fixed price. You get a break on those instances, and you still pay for additional consumption and storage. But since you're prepaying, as described, there is a significant cost differential. That's our approach in Florida.
Valley?
Yeah. So in Maryland, we actually are defining, how we want to actually approach this from the long run perspective. Currently, we are actually using the pay-as-you-go model, so it's more dynamic. You just pay for what we use for. Right now, we are in the development and deployment phase, so we actually cannot predict exactly, how many instances we need to keep it running because, our environment is very dynamic. We keep changing the number of instances. We are evaluating, products very frequently. So we actually have decided to stick to the pay-as-you-go model. But, overall, we are working with our other state agencies and even at the governor's office to treat, infrastructure use, especially with cloud computing, as like an utility. How we actually pay for your electricity, your, water. We actually are kind of redefining how we want to approach this. This is pretty much like your, utility type of, expense. So that's what we are actually trying to, help them to understand. We have not gotten there yet, but that's where we want to actually go with. We may stick to pay-as-you-go model, at least for the next, few years until we reach a steady state where we actually can predict how much we will be using, on an annual basis.
Good. So that segues quite nicely into the next topic or the next question, and that's about cloud management, which is a concept that means a user has control over everything that operates in the cloud, the data, the applications, and the services. So importantly, which tools do you use to monitor cloud costs, particularly in a pay-as-you-go environment? What tools do you use to optimize resources, data integration, and manage cloud instances? And we'll start off with Valley.
Yeah, sure. Since we are actually sticking to the pay-as-you-go model, we actually get like a detailed billing from AWS on a monthly basis, how much we actually have used, where we have used, who has used. So we have all those breakdowns because that's provided by the cloud vendor. So we are very closely monitoring, and we just recently did some cleanup in terms of, we created many sandbox environments. So we actually looked at the usage and then started shutting down some of them that were not required. So that's like an ongoing activity we've been doing just from the invoice perspective. That's after the fact. But now we are getting more proactive. We are actually using CloudWatch, and we have our other monitoring tools like Sensu and Splunk. These tools help us to really understand on a daily basis how our infrastructure is being consumed. Based on that, we are actually proactively managing how many instances we are keeping online, and we are also trying to automate with scripting to actually bring down the instances which are no longer, required even during our, weekends, for example. So the team is currently working on monitoring and adjusting the scripts to, take care of that to reduce the, usage and cost from that perspective. But we are also making sure that we are not impacting the service level from the user and the team perspective when they actually have to meet deadlines. They have to keep the instances running longer, on weekends too. So we actually manage that very closely using these 3 or 4 different tools we have in place.
Good. Linda and Jay, can you tell us what tools you use to monitor your whole cloud experience?
Sure. we look at a couple different options here. So first up, dealing with cost. Obviously, this is going to come back to more as the options where you deal with pay-as-you-go. If you have a direct cost, it's not really something to monitor so much. You should know what that is. But when you're dealing with things like AWS and large Azure environments where you spend resources up and immediately start paying for them, obviously you need to monitor that or things can spiral out of control very quickly. And as mentioned, AWS has some really nice reporting that they send out, as does Azure has nice reporting it sends out. But as nice as it is, a lot of times it's not as comprehensive as you want, or there's things inside it that don't quite make sense. I know I haven't seen AWS ones in quite some time, but with Azure, they have a horrible tendency of naming things very cryptically. So you do need to look for something to kind of break through, some of the things that are hard to decipher. And I will say this: Microsoft does have a very nice Power BI report that you can easily integrate into your environment that provides an extremely easy way to view your current utilization over a period of time, be it 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, look at what the trend utilization is, look at individual resources, tail it down to even individual resources that are tagged in certain ways. So if you have a project that you spin up in your environment and you mark those resources correctly, you can watch those resources over a period of time and understand exactly how much cost that they're consuming. But a lot of this is going to come back to the cloud vendor itself, and I'll just use AWS and Azure as one of the larger ones that deal with pay-as-you-go type of a modeling. When it gets to monitoring, that is a whole other ballgame that it can be really difficult to do because you've got so many different things to monitor in a cloud environment. When you start looking at things like virtual machines, so you can treat a virtual machine in Azure just like a virtual machine sitting in your own data center. So whatever you want to monitor that with, be it System Center Operations Manager, Manage Engine Tools, SolarWinds, whatever you got, that can monitor your VM to your heart's content. But when you start getting into platform as a service monitoring, be it something like Dynamics or hosted web apps, those are much more difficult to tend to monitor the same way as something like a virtual machine. A lot of vendors, again being AWS and Azure, do provide decent monitoring, but more than one monitoring tool is best if you can get it. I don't know of anybody that relies on a single monitoring tool and just hopes that it's always good. One thing that we've found is monitors like PRTG, if anybody had ever used one before, they have nice options in the sense that they have what's known as a cloud monitoring tool where you can actually use one of their data centers to remotely connect to your platform as a service resources. So it cuts out lots of things. It cuts out my data center as potentially being a connectivity problem. It cuts out a resource in Azure, in our example, for being a connectivity problem. It actually uses PRTG's monitoring data center to reach out to my resource in Azure and make sure that it's available. Is it responding to ping? Is the web page coming up correctly? Is whatever resource there, appropriately responding? So again, this is just another model of a hosted resource, but having a hosted monitoring solution to reach out and touch those environments, is a nice option to have, and really cuts down on the false positives that you receive when trying to watch those resources and make sure that they're up and running correctly.
Thank you. And Joe, because you have this multi-cloud approach, what tools do you use for all of those instances?
Yeah, like the other states, we rely on the tools we get from the cloud vendor. So they are significant. They are in detail, as you've heard. And I do have people, quite frankly, who pore over those bills every month. I think we heard that explained from one of the states. Because it's not only just consumption, right? Because consumption or consumption-based models are double-edged sword. It's so easy to do things in these cloud environments with their on-demand tools and the things you can spin up. It's also easy to forget what's going out there. So it's constant vigilance to make sure that you don't have disconnected instances, whether they're compute or storage sitting out there. Beyond the cost, those can create security risks for your environment. But it's an ongoing monitoring of the bill and the detail that comes in. And it's also, one thing that we're also learning is it's not just monitoring what you're doing and what you have and what you don't need. It's also constantly looking as the cloud environment and instances and storage type grows to make sure that you're optimizing and using the right resources in the cloud. So we've probably had more opportunity to refine the overall cloud infrastructure for our solutions that are running in it and reduce cost than we have wild instances that we just didn't know were there. So it's really it's a matter of constant vigilance on reviewing the tools that are there and integrating it into your change management processes so you're not ginning up new instances without having gone through a process to identify them and make sure that they're coming in the bill. Because like you've heard said, the minute you create them, you're getting billed.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about data. There is an expectation in child welfare that record, especially validated abuse and neglect findings, should be available for quite a long time. Some agencies also have purge requirements. With data stored in the cloud, have you had to change your approach to archiving and purging data? And if so, in what ways? Do you find it more or less expensive and more or less complicated? And let's start with Joe.
Sure. So probably like a lot of states, we have all our data in our system from the time we turned it on. You heard me talk a little bit about that in the prior answer to a prior question. So I don't have a set of customers here who have a real appetite for purging data. The information that's in our child welfare system supports ongoing analytics. The whole intake to investigation process is dependent on the history of information that we have in the system. And so prior to the cloud, we were storing that in all of the information in the most expensive data stores that you possibly could, and that's memory on the mainframe. And so since our transition off the mainframe and movement to the cloud, our storage costs have certainly come down exponentially for that reason. What we're doing now is we're looking at, again, I don't expect to get to purging. What we're looking at now is as we start talking about CWIS and we start to look at components of our current child welfare system to redefine and refine, we're looking at ways that we can now leverage the cloud to take advantage of storage capabilities that weren't at our disposal when we moved it in. So, for example, most of the cloud, at least the consumption-based cloud providers have it, but Amazon has something called Glacier, which is cloud storage that you can put something in. It takes a little time to get it in and out of there, or to get it out if you want to use it operationally. But there's a large subset of data, in particular documents and images that we have stored in our system that are now candidates to be able to put into long-term cloud storage, which is significantly cheaper. And so we'll start looking at, as opposed to purging, how we can start archiving this data and build the system so that it's integrated with those capabilities to pull it back in when it's needed. Beyond that, I think the biggest savings are the fact that our child welfare system, like most states, will grow in data every day that it's running. And so the opportunity to have lesser cost in storage, which we do in the cloud, is an ongoing part of the whole cost benefit for years into the future.
Cool. Linda and Jay, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. This is Linda. You've been hearing from Jay for a while, so I'll try to speak up. So on our child welfare, like Joe, our system is 20 plus years old, and so archiving and purging was what's that? And I think with the opportunity that CWIS affords us, and we're leveraging cloud solutions, our data quality plans, how we're approaching building our schemas and data models, we're building in archiving and purging requirements with that. So definitely our approach has changed. We'll actually do it, and do I find it more or less expensive? Actually, I think it's cheaper. We actually, now that we have ways to either fail over, we have ways to archive, We have ways to purge. It's definitely less of a footprint and definitely less expensive than having all of that infrastructure on the mainframe capable to handle it. And our data quality plan and how we're developing that is really giving us the means to be able to archive and purge and store our data appropriately.
Great, thank you. So, Valerie, for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the next question. And basically, state IT managers are faced with staff who are originally hired to support an on-premise business model. With the migration to cloud computing, how are you aligning those staffer skill sets to the evolving demands of cloud computing? As well, can you speak to the separation of tasks and the differing responsibilities between state IT and agency IT?
Yeah, sure. One advantage I wanted to bring it to here is when we started the Maryland Think, we already have made decisions in terms of how we want to, move forward with modernization. So we chose cloud. So we pretty much built a team from the ground up. So if you really think about our state IT staff who are part of the Maryland Think, we have hired people with cloud experience. So that's one big thing from our starting perspective, that we were very sure that we want to get the right people for the job. The second thing is all our agency IT staff, they were not hands-on. We pretty much were using, vendors to do the IT work thus far. So that actually gave us some advantage over, we don't have to retrain any of our agency IT staff to actually use any of the newer technology, because they are only doing pretty much the coordination work, since we did not have any data center from the department perspective for a long time now. The third thing is in terms of skill set, we talked about the state IT staff. They already are, having that experience with the cloud environment. We also brought the, independent, consultants to work with us with that right skill set. So we are not dependent on vendors from that perspective also. So we use our IDIQ contract to really staff the team with the right skills and, with the cutting-edge technology changing, on a daily basis. We were able to get the right resource to do this job. So at least from the Maryland perspective, we pretty much are very clear from day one what type of resources we want to use. And, from the, execution perspective, it made our life really easy. That's one of the reasons we were able to stand up the, entire platform less than a year. And we already put 2 systems in production, and we are about to put the third one in a few months.
Great. Joe, how about your challenges in terms of retooling some of your staff to meet the demands of new technology and cloud computing?
Sure. So when we turned on cloud, really I had to look at the team and think about how we were going to manage it. And I had a structure here supported by senior level architects, so enterprise architecture, application, network architecture. And so one of the things I did was to create a cloud architect. And basically that manager came from my world of what I like to call wrench turners, the guys and gals who really keep our infrastructure running, the folks who actually do the work and create a position of somebody who basically makes sure the work gets done in the cloud, particularly with our managed service providers, to make sure that the environment is secure and to make sure that it keeps operating and it's managed against some of the things that we've talked previously about. So it's not an absolute line. We have had to take our infrastructure resources who are hands-on because there's integration at the security level. Our Active Directory crosses the boundaries of cloud and on-premise, and so there's a constant look at the kinds of skills that folks need to now integrate with, even if you're not managing things in the cloud. And the issues can be different because they often bring in multiple disciplines, like a lot of on-premise issues do too. And so I haven't been successful in doing what I thought I would originally do, which was to basically create a cloud management discipline and staff that, because all of the application issues, all of the infrastructure issues are related and dependent on the folks who work through it. So we've taken folks through cloud training, cloud management, some of the technical training, and in the case of our cloud architect, that person's working to become Amazon certified. Those skills are very hard to bring into state government, and we have leveraged some consulting resources, much like my partners.
Okay, so let's move on now to our favorite topic, and that's lessons learned. So in September, when we did Cloud One webinar, we identified a lot of lessons learned. And given the topics that we've been talking about, I'm sure we can add to that list. So I would like to give Linda and Jay the first opportunity to share with us some new lessons learned.
Well, we were just trying to think about some of our lessons learned, and my goodness, we have them every day. So staffing, as Joe mentioned, staffing is difficult, and I would say it's not even down to just cloud computing or narrowed down to cloud computing. It's just about every IT role right now is a struggle to fill, and I would say that's nationwide. There's a demand for resources, and for resources on skill sets that we didn't need 2 years ago. So I think that's a constant struggle, and the states are really going to have a problem with that. So while my lessons learned is we have to be kind of clever about how we identify and bring new talent onto the scene.
Yeah, and I would say a couple of the biggest things is to just, I may have mentioned this last time as well, but I can't stress this enough, is to make sure that whomever your major vendor it is, be it Amazon Web Services, be it Azure, whoever you're using to host the majority of your resources, that you have a very engaged relationship with that vendor. And I'll use ours, with Microsoft as a bit of an example. I mean, I have biweekly calls with a lot of their Azure specialists to discuss a lot of the new options that are coming down the pipe, what's working, what's not working, people that have set things up that are similar to what we're doing in other states, be it both commercial and government side. Having that information sort of on tap and available to you when you need it, is just invaluable. So if you can find a vendor, and I know Amazon Web Services has very similar, people that they have on staff that provide this information. But that is by far one of the biggest things to make sure that you kind of have in your pocket. And obviously the other aspect, which we talked about earlier, is monitoring, because the options in the cloud change constantly. The ability to monitor those options are also constantly changing as well. And by monitoring, that goes from anything from is a resource up and running to, as we were talking about earlier, in terms of billing, who's doing what in your environment, being able to audit what's happening, in your hosted environment. So when all of a sudden a virtual machine pops up that's got 128 gigs of RAM and 16 processors that's costing you, $10,000 a month, you got to know who did that, why did it happen, and where did it happen. So this comes back to what I believe Joe was talking about earlier, things like your change control processes, your auditing processes. I mean, all of these things really extend, but need to be a bit more agile when you start dealing with those cloud resources.
Great. Valley, do you have some lessons learned to share with us, please?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. I would say the best one I have learned after joining the state, coming from private side is managing expectations. So when I say that, it's actually both at the state level, agency level, as well as the project level. So when we actually talk about how much we are planning to spend from budget perspective, we need to actually make sure that everyone understands exactly how cloud works, why there are fluctuations in terms of usage costs. We need to hire someone very quickly, even if we have to hire someone for a very short time, paying for the highest number of I would say the high rate. So there are a lot of these things probably from the state and agency IT budget perspective. They don't have experience in how this thing works, right? It's more dynamic. Setting up the expectation with that group was the biggest challenge I ran into. And we are actually working very closely with them to make sure that they understand the dynamic nature of what it takes to modernize and move everything from data center to cloud. And at the same time building new applications that requires a lot of resources. So that's one of the biggest challenges. So that I would actually suggest that every other state or agency planning to do it just spend enough time, make sure the leadership understands that. The second thing is the staffing. I believe I think everybody is kind of having the same struggle that we are currently having. Being very close to DC, where we have to compete with federal agency, who are also now trying to move into cloud. So getting like a security architect, getting like an AWS solution architect with the right skill and experience, it's getting really tougher and tougher as we make progress. But we are fortunate enough to go through our IDIQ contract, and sometimes we have to pay premium to get the resources. But we are getting wiser now to use them for short duration or where we need. So we are working on kind of utilizing the resources the best possible way. So these are the two major things, at least from my personal experience, I have learned in the last few months working on this state project.
Excellent. Joe, what can you add, sir?
Well, maybe one thing that we've learned along the way is, when you start down this path, it's all about bringing up your solution, bringing up the cloud infrastructure, SLAs around it, network security, all of those technical things that in many cases are daunting when you head down this path. And I think what we've learned is in the beginning part and then throughout, as you move your systems and you put these agreements or you do procurements for the work, it's important to think of the end management model that you're going to have and build in elements into those processes that can help you when you get there. And to give you a specific example, so we're running our child welfare system in the cloud. It's great. It's there. Well, that environment needs to change. Who's responsible for architecting the new instances? Who's responsible for creating those instances? Once they're up and running, who's responsible for installing the security elements to it? If you think about the end environment that you're going to be in, whether that's through a managed service provider, which is the model that we've got in place, contract and managed service provider, or whether that's your state data center, I often find that we can do everything faster in the cloud than we can in all of the activities we need to get something done. So my team can bring up instances and storage instances, compute instances in a matter of minutes. But the process to be able to get a PO through, to be able to get the vendor to do it, the process to get them to plan and to price an a la carte that says if I'm bringing up a database instance, what's the cost? It's not just the ongoing cost, it's the cost to bring it up. So think about the management environment that you'll end up with at the end when you have your system or your solutions in the cloud, and try and think about the things that will need to be in place when you get that operational environment and bring those in early on, even if it's a part of negotiations when you're selecting a cloud vendor or a managed service provider.
Well, I want to thank our four panelists. I submit that you have added additional and very valuable information and certainly built off of Cloud 1 to Cloud 2. So that concludes the discussion portion of the roundtable, which of course we hope was informative and helpful. I would now like to invite my colleague Alex to run the Q&A session. So next slide, and Alex, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Operator, would you be so kind as to remind everyone how to ask a question?
Absolutely. If you'd like to ask your question over the phone line, first please ensure your phone is unmuted, then press *1 and record your name when prompted to place your line into the queue. Again, *1 to ask your question over the phone line.
All right, Operator, I have a few questions here. I'll get started on those, then I'll check in with you. The first question for the panel, how did you choose the Amazon Web Service solution versus another? And I imagine for those of you that chose Azure, similar question. How did you choose the solution you went with versus another?
Linda speaks.
Hi, this is Arizona. We'll go ahead and take that question. Jay?
Yeah, well, for us, I mean, we're not in Amazon Web Service, we are in Azure, but again, we were a fairly early adopter, in our opinion. When we started rolling this out, it's been close to 3 years now. So there weren't a ton of options, especially when looking for all the types of services. We wanted to host an entire infrastructure from, domain controllers, like say DNS, DHCP, federation services, and really AWS and Azure really were the only ones. At the time, the main reason we went with Azure was twofold. One, they had a specific government cloud, which had the different FedRAMP compliant methods, and because of some of the data that we deal with, that was very important to us. Now, a lot of those requirements today have kind of either evened out or diminished. A lot of the public clouds still have certain levels of FedRAMP compliance. The other aspect for us, though, was at the time especially, we were a very heavy Microsoft shop. We were leveraging and currently migrating to O365 at the time. All of our main infrastructure services were running off of mainly Microsoft boxes. So because we had that relationship, it really made sense for us at that time to go with Azure as our main vendor because we could leverage everything that we had done with Microsoft in the past and get the resources that we needed and that vendor relationship already in place to continue sort of growing it. So that was really one of our main reasons.
And I'll just add on to that. We also looked at our enterprise agreement and how we could leverage that relationship that Jay talked about, adding in premier hours to upskill and train our resources. So we really tried to build that relationship, and Microsoft really came to the table for us in that environment to be able to do that. So it's also about what can your cloud provider help in training your resources as well.
How about Florida or Maryland? Would you care to share why you chose the provider you went with?
This is Joe in Florida. We set out through a procurement on basically a national contract that had all of the cloud providers on it. And so we didn't seek a particular cloud provider. What we did was, as we went through procurement, we had a lot of discussions with the resellers. The majority, so basically, we only had the option of some bare metal as a service, basically full price hosting. Microsoft and Amazon were the three prevalent proposals that we received. The large majority of the proposals were proposals to utilize Amazon. So we had a lot of discussions with the resellers when they came in. And the thing that pointed us in that direction, we're not a huge Microsoft shop, so that wasn't an element that went into our negotiations. But the sheer number of tools and capabilities that the Amazon infrastructure afforded for us to not only transition but host the environment, manage it, and really leverage it are the elements that really hit it home for us.
Valley speaks.
From Maryland, I believe the decision was already made to go with the AWS before I joined this engagement. But what I heard is there is a NASPO Valley Point cloud solution contract where it was actually already in place with multiple states, and Maryland, added themselves to that. That helps them to quickly procure AWS type of, infrastructure as a service. So that is what, I came to know. But in general, overall, in Maryland, we actually have looked at other cloud solution as well from Microsoft Azure and Google. This is after the fact that we already had AWS decision made before I joined the project. So that's all I can add.
Okay, thank you, panel. The next question, can you speak to any barriers you had with your state security staff when seeking ATO to use public cloud, public Amazon cloud? So more generally, though, how did you overcome any barriers from your state security teams?
So I can add a few points there. From Maryland perspective, we actually had the CISO embedded within our team. So basically, the CISO had to work with our security team for almost 6 to 8 months when we initially set up the infrastructure. So a lot of guidelines and a lot of back and forth happened during our design stage itself. That helped us a lot when we were ready to do the ATO and the ATC type of work within the last 4 or 5 months. So our experience was making sure the security team work very closely with the certification authority. We actually are talking about from the state security team, the agency security team, the project security team, as well as the federal partners, where we had to work with them very constantly. We actually had, I believe, every other week one conference call with all the stakeholders involved to go over any specific questions they may have in terms of understanding the design and approving the design, getting through the architecture, and also making sure all the controls in place. So that was like a more collaborative and very comprehensive work. We had about a team of, I believe, 12 members who focused only on this part. So that really helped us to get through the ATO and ATC.
How about Arizona or Florida? Any challenges or barriers you had to overcome? And if so, how did you address those?
This is Jay from Arizona. We didn't have many large barriers as much as it was just making sure a lot of people, kind of understood, what was happening and how it was happening. Because things can be done differently in the cloud, and certain people may have been used to Amazon Web Services terminology that didn't translate directly to Azure terminology. So once you sort of get that dictionary lined up, people kind of understood, how things were moving along. But one of the things that we always need to make sure happens is whenever something gets stood up, very different from something being done on-prem, where it's much more, you own everything more, from one end to the other. With the cloud, it's a little bit different, and things can be done in very different ways to achieve, the same goal. And because so many new services come online constantly, you can do something very differently tomorrow that you're doing a different way today with different cloud options. So we just need to make sure anytime something is set up that we introduce in our process that it goes through multiple levels of review that bring in not only our security team, but also we also measure against the state level security requirements to make sure that we're not going outside the box and inadvertently doing something that we didn't mean to do. And this can be done on multiple levels. We bring the vendor in on this. Like I say, we bring our own security teams in on this. So it really just comes down to more rigor and control than most anything else. But we really didn't have many hurdles to go through, as an agency ourselves.
This is Joe in Florida. I think the one, I like that term, hurdle better than barrier, that we had to jump over was basically solid knowledge of the cloud environment. And what I mean by that is we originally architected our cloud environment to be in the Amazon government cloud because, hey, we're government and that's where government stuff goes. But ultimately, after many gyrations and, quite frankly, a lot of work with Amazon and understanding the differences between the environments and the differences between how all of the security controls link to data and security, it turned out that we didn't need to be in the government cloud. And so I think it's fair to say that your decision on services or the type of cloud that you're moving your solution into is not something that you can make assumptions on because for us at least it really didn't match the environment that we ended up with.
Well, thank you, panel. Operator, I have one more written question. Do you have anyone in the queue to speak?
I've got no questions from the phone lines.
All right. I'll go to the written question. This is directed to Arizona. What application software is used for your child welfare module? And then for Maryland, a similar question came later. What are you using?
Hi, this is Linda in Arizona. So if you remember back on our infrastructure slide that we showed our cloud architecture, we are actually building our CWIS system on Microsoft Dynamics. We are also leveraging Highland OnBase for our content management. We are using Azure services for our data sharing and integrated services between agencies. And we are using InRule as a rules engine for to manage and to dynamically change policy for our child welfare. And we are using Diona as our mobile solution. So that's what comprises our child welfare system. Did I forget one, Jay?
No, that pretty much covers
okay.
it. Yeah, there's a lot of moving, sort of parts in this, because for us, when we're putting together, an extremely comprehensive system, there really wasn't one, piece that would just solve every problem. So. We have a lot of data warehouse and data management sitting inside, Azure specifically. We have a lot of the portals and end user interaction, sitting inside Dynamics. And then, as Linda stated, we have a lot of our content management in terms of documents and pictures and information being stored inside Highland's cloud, inside their OnBase, infrastructure. So it's a very large mix of different vendors and different hosted environments, but we're bringing them all together mainly through, I will say this, the main cohesive unit that sort of links them all together is all the components that we're building in Azure in terms of service bus and function apps and sort of linking all of these options and integrations so that they all can talk to one another and retrieve the data necessary.
Valley speaks.
Okay, from Maryland, what we are doing for child welfare is using an open source case management platform. This is built on Java stack. We have Node.js, Angular, and Java. The backend is Postgres database. So we actually made sure when we started this entire MD Think platform, we actually wanted to go with the open source as much as possible. So that is our primary way of using all these open source products and build a solution. For rules engine, we are using Corticon, and for reporting, we are using ClickSense.
All right, thank you. That ends our written questions. Operator, anyone on standby?
No questions from the phones.
All right, then Joyce, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Next slide, please. And I just want to quickly add a little disclaimer that certainly ACF does not condone or support any specific tool or app. So it is all about your requirements and what your agency finds best for them. So I want to certainly thank Linda and Jay and Valley and Joe. Just a very informative session. If you would like to contact them directly, please direct your inquiry to my colleague Nick Mosier.
That email address is nicholas.mozer@acf.hhs.gov.
Again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. When it is complete and posted, a message will be sent announcing availability on the Children's Bureau website. So as we move forward, while we don't have any dates determined yet, the trending next webinar topics are lessons learned from implementing mobility and development operations business integration. So thank you for attending, and that ends the roundtable discussion webinar. Goodbye.
Once again, with that, we'll conclude today's conference. Thank you for participating, and you may disconnect your lines at this time.